Hi everyone and welcome. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes while people join, but thanks very much for joining us.
It's nice to see we've got people coming in from all over the world. Wow.
From Ecuador to Oman to Thailand to Romania and Bulgaria.
Lithuania, Peru, Philippines.
Welcome to all. We're going to start in just about 2 minutes. Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon from National Geographic Learning. My name is Caitlin Thomas, coming to you just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome to today's webinar, Mediation, What is it and Why is it important? Presented by Rachel Gibbon and Delia Kidd. Rachel is a global publisher for ELT at National Geographic Learning. She holds an MA in Educational Research with a focus on education and social justice from Lancaster University. Following several years teaching teens and adults in Italy, she's worked in educational publishing for 15 years in the UK and Turkey, overseeing the publication of a number of flagship titles. Her favorite part of every project is getting back into the classroom with teachers and learners to understand their challenges and aspirations so she can better support their achievements with learning materials that both motivate and inspire. Welcome to Rachel. And Delia. Delia is a managing development editor at National Geographic Learning, also based in the UK. She has a master's in English language teaching and experience in educational research and publishing, as well as several years as a primary and EFL teacher and materials developer in multiple countries, including South Africa, South Korea, Italy, and the UK. So before we get started, I'd like to take just a minute to go over some housekeeping items. First of all, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that there are several icons. The first button on the left is the chat function. Please be sure to send your messages to everyone. We want to know what you have to say, and so we want to make sure that the whole group can read your message. On the right, you'll see a Q&A button. Please use this to ask questions, and we will have some dedicated time at the end of the session to go through your questions. Finally, we will be sending along a certificate of attendance and a recording of this session within 5 business days of this webinar. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our speakers. Delia and Rachel, take it away.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great to see you all here. And we should probably clarify before we get started, this is a webinar about mediation. We had a person join us this morning who reflected at the end that they thought it was going to be about meditation. So just in case we don't want to disappoint you, But we do have some content on meditation too, if that was what you were interested in, we can direct you to. What we want to do today is to spend some time looking at the concept of mediation as it was introduced with the 2018 companion booklet into the Common European Framework, and really then to start thinking, to explore that concept, and then to really think about practical examples of how we might integrate this into teaching practice, and to share some examples with you of how we've tried to develop that within our materials that might give you ideas to use in class. And to get started, really, we wanted to think about what does mediation mean to us? And Delia, before 2018, if 5 years ago, before the CEFR published the new companion booklet with the scales for mediation, if I'd have said to you before that, what does mediation mean? What would spring to mind?
Well, I think it would probably be the first thought would be around things like conflict, dispute, and mediators who kind of try to find resolution between arguing countries, or lawyers and divorce settlements and so on. That's the kind of thing I think I would have thought of.
Yeah. And in that kind of capacity, you'd have like a mediator, like a neutral third party, usually, like you say, in a situation of conflict. And their role would be to kind of help each party define what the issues were, to help them see things from each other's perspective, and to move them towards some sort of a resolution. And I think thinking about that, you can kind of see some parallels with what happens within language in terms of mediation. If you don't mind just going over to the next slide, I think the word cloud that we can see here, it really does relate to that common understanding of mediation, that the one that, in life outside of language learning, where you've got these words like negotiation and advice, diplomacy, but also at the periphery of this, we can see some of the things that relate more easily maybe to language learning, things like moving towards a solution or a resolution, cooperating.
Yeah, relationship, leadership, together. So yeah, it's really about that kind of the way that we kind of connect to this word, like what do we associate it with? And actually, if we take a kind of step back and think of it in more broader terms, it can be applied to so many different situations, different contexts.
Yeah, and so maybe next it's helpful for us to consider, why is it that the CEFR felt that this was the right moment in 2018 to publish this companion booklet, to mark a shift really in the way that we looked at language?
Yeah, I think that's kind of exactly what the CEFR decided to do, was to think about the relevance of mediation within language learning, and how it could kind of bring that in to support language learners and teachers across the world. And they really just recognized that actually we're living in a much more globalized world. There is a lot more kind of mobility across nations. There's a lot more kind of intercultural communication happening, cross language, cross barriers, etc. And so the role of mediation in language learning has become much more prominent and much more important. That it's such a valuable skill for people to be able to kind of mediate between situations and between languages and so on. It kind of has progressed from that sort of former understanding of language as being just a practice of 4 skills, which is kind of, reading, writing, speaking, listening, to recognize it as more as an overarching encompassment of different modes, such as things like, receptive skills, productive skills, but even within that kind of interaction as well as mediation. So it's looking at it in a more kind of from a communicative point of view, and how students are likely to be using the language and in what context and so on. For that reason, the CEFR decided to bring it into the companion volume, which was started in 2018, published 2020, and make it much more of a kind of systematic approach, bring it out to the fore, give it more descriptors of how it should look in the language classroom.
Yeah.
And next model. Rachel, do you want to tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, so this this model kind of really helps us visualize how the different four modes of communication that you've just outlined, Delia, work together. And a little known fact actually is that mediation was always intended to be part of the Common European Framework of Languages. The diagram that we can see up on the screen was part of a 1998 publication by the Council of Europe, and that came out just before the first iteration of the CEFR in 2001. And that when the Council of Europe published the companion booklet, they acknowledged it had always been their intention to include mediation, but they hadn't quite settled on a definition at that stage. But they felt that it was important to make this change because it really gets to the heart of the process of language learning and language use. And I think that's what you can see from this diagram. It's the process of what happens during a communicative encounter. So while you know there is a receptive aspect of communication, we're receiving a communication, and there's the productive aspect where we're actually transmitting language and a communication. Mediation acts as a kind of filter for both of these stages. So when you receive information or you're on the receptive end of a communicative encounter, you are mediating the information that comes to you, making sense of it and creating meaning, drawing on your own prior experiences, drawing on your own prior knowledge. I think this is what mediation does, really. Those of you who have done teaching theory will probably know of Vygotsky's concept of communication and cognition as a kind of outside-in process. And what mediation does is really recognize the role of the learner as a social agent. The mediation is a reflective stage in a process of communication that occurs from the point of interaction, and that it informs future interaction. So that's why we can see these arrows going back and forth.
Yeah. I think what's interesting as well is that these are all quite familiar concepts as well, and what we'll see as we go forward is actually it's not really anything new for us as language teachers and practitioners. These are all things that we're kind of already doing in our classrooms already, but what the CFR is kind of trying to do is to take a bit more of a systematic approach and make it a bit more kind of part of a framework that we can use to support the teaching practices and sort of assessment of learners through mediation.
Yeah, and I think that's what really helps us as educators, really. The framework in itself isn't intended to give us additional work to do. Like you say, it's outlining things that already happen, but it just enables us to be more intentional about them. And also as content creators and working in the process of producing materials for learning, it enables us to be much more systematic about the types of aspects of mediation skills that we cover within our materials.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what the CFR has helpfully done, as with all of its other kind of areas, is develop a series of can-do statements related to the different areas of mediation. And I've just put up a few examples here. Mediation is divided into these three areas. So mediating a text, mediating concepts, and mediating communication. And I think this is already quite interesting to see because it shows us that mediation is more than just speaking. So it occurs not just in speaking activities, but in a whole range of different activities. When you're mediating a text, for example, this might be simply kind of understanding what the text is about and interpreting the information and adding some personal reflection to it. So like this particular descriptor here, expressing a personal response to creative texts. It can use simple words and phrases to say how the work makes him or her feel. That is a mediation task as well. Things like mediating concepts. Here we've got aspects such as collaboration within group work, leadership within that group work, how you kind of control and maybe assign roles to your task, to your team members, make sure everybody's included. There's an element of sort of social and emotional kind of learning there, making sure that everybody is participating and everybody is confident and included. And then as well here, mediating communication. So this might be that kind of the maybe more typical understanding of mediation in the sense of being able to translate between languages in a pluricultural space. Or which I think is that's quite an interesting one, because it's very much related to everyday life, you know, something that would be naturally happening outside of the classroom as well. So an important skill to help learners with.
And I think Olivia's made an important point as well, that he's saying it's very insightful to see it's not only about direct communication between two people verbally. And I think this is an important point, that mediation occurs both within a person. So there's the interpersonal aspect of mediation, where you are on the receptive end of a communication, and then you, within your own mind, there's a communicative process that happens where you make sense of it. And they refer to that within the definition of mediation as intrapersonal communication. And the interpersonal aspect, where you might work with another person or more than one person to make sense of something and to create meaning together. And that can happen either verbally or in written form. And the Council of Europe said they felt that was very important in the definition, because with technology, actually, contrary to what we might assume, people are communicating much more in written form, you know, through social media posts, emails, text messages, and they wanted to really recognise that in the update to the CEFR.
Yeah. What you need to do is look at the kind of comments box online to see people kind of mediating in an online text format as well, to see that different type of mode. If we have a look at the kind of the next slide, we've got how the CFR defines mediation.
So this is the official definition. Yeah.
So if we just give you a minute to read through these.
And could you, as you read through it, if you could make a note in the chat of any of the things you notice about the language that's used, or anything that surprises you, or about the types of things that are defined as included in mediation. I think, Delia, one thing that stood out to me was there's kind of this language of construction of the social agent creating bridges, constructing meaning, this sense that the learner has this really active role in building, in the building blocks of language, in building meaning. Olivia would like to see agent
agent replaced by human. To me, actually, the word agent is quite a useful one, because it also kind of places the learner or the speaker as the person who's kind of controlling that interaction and has a big part to play in that interaction. So it's sort of leaning towards that sense of kind of learner autonomy as well, and that they, you know, this is part of their own building of their kind of communicative skills and so on.
Yeah, and that was I think intentional, because, you know, this is an action-oriented approach. It focuses on what a learner needs to do with language in a social context, and the role that they play as an interpreter and as an intermediary. So rather than language being this passive thing that we memorize or learn, a subject that just needs to be learned and needs to be consumed, it's the idea that it's something that is constantly created and interpreted and added to by the people who are using the language. And I think in our session earlier today, one of the participants pointed out to us actually that this is relevant whether you're talking about your first language or a language that you've learned. You know, mediation can happen in the context of any type of communication in any language, and which kind of also brings in the plurilingual aspect, because sometimes it's between languages. Which is sort of what this, I think, as well, this last sentence here, that the context can be social, pedagogic, cultural, linguistic, or professional. So there's a huge
variety of contexts and formats in which this would occur. So it kind of goes beyond language learning skills.
Yeah. And this is where it brings in kind of a lot of what we often refer to as soft skills. And, you know, we've already made mention of social and emotional skills. I think you can see that these various elements that we've represented in this diagram really, just to really highlight that there are lots of different interlocking and overlapping elements that make up what's happening in the process of mediation. So what's really significant about this shift to the four modes of communication is that it recognises that to use a language effectively and to interact with others effectively, we need skills that go beyond just language, beyond just proficiency in the language. And Brian North, who was a lead member of the Working Party who developed the CEFR, described mediation as a nomadic notion. And I really like this term, the idea that it's a nomadic notion because it's open to flexible interpretation. So, you know, we can see that language is used for social interaction and it's used across language barriers, hence the plurilingual aspect. And sometimes the mediator is mediating between people who don't speak each other's language, but they do speak both of those languages. And that's also quite a common interpretation of mediation. We need emotional intelligence for effective communication, particularly when we are communicating across linguistic and cultural boundaries. And in communicative encounters, for them to be successful, participants need to collaborate, to interpret and to create meaning. And an effective communicator actively facilitates and provides the appropriate conditions for a successful communicative encounter. And this is another important aspect and one that will come out through some of our examples. The role in communication to create the right conditions for successful communication to take place, for learners to really think critically about what is the best forum for communication, what's the best medium for communication, what's the best way to represent information, really thinking about their audience and being sensitive to that. So they're employing lots of different skills there in terms of empathy, but also a critical understanding of how communication works.
Yeah, it's that kind of beyond what they need to communicate to, well, how are they going to communicate that the most effectively? I think that's really relevant in this context. We're going to have a look at some examples now, and I think, Rachel, you're going to have talk us through this first example, which I'm actually just going to skip over to show you in our Spark platform so that I can zoom in and show you specific aspects. But Rachel, do you want to tell us a bit about what's going on in this?
So we have the framework to work from, as we all do, that the CEFR has provided us with. But what we really try to do when we create our materials is to provide really a kind of all the steps, you know, and all the tools that teachers and learners might need in class, really to make that happen within a class. And I think this is a great example from Voices. Voices is a 7-level general English series. In each of the units at all levels, we have this lesson D where we focus on interpersonal and intercultural skills in particular. And that's a great place to develop mediation skills. In this particular example, we're focusing on managing group conversations, and we follow a kind of sequence of how we realize this within each of these D lessons. So first, we get the learners to reflect on their own communicative style, on the typical style. We all have typical styles, default styles of communication that we use in different circumstances. And we encourage learners to be reflective about this. We then provide them with a scenario to get them to try and recognize what's going on in a particular communicative scenario, to think about it critically. They then watch a video and we can see how the video works here too. And these videos, some of them are animations, some of them are one of our authors, Chia, talking about that particular type of communicative scenario, the different challenges that it might pose, the different communication styles that we might encounter. They then look at a communication skill where they're given guidance with different techniques that they could potentially employ in those type of situations. So here we're talking about managing group conversations. So we're giving them guidance and advice about how to ensure that when they are responsible for managing a group conversation, to ensure that that is a successful communicative encounter. So things like planning what you want to say, being aware of other people's communication styles, asking questions when you don't understand, being attuned to the group, like listen, watch them, try to understand how the group operates. They then take those skills and what they've learned from the video and apply it to other communicative scenarios. So that's giving them the opportunity really in the safe space of the classroom to rehearse how to apply those skills in real life. And then they again have an opportunity to do a role play with their classmates of a similar scenario to apply those skills in practice. So it's really nicely scaffolded for them, this process, to really give them the chance to be ready for the real world when they go out of the class.
I think that's another thing to highlight here, is that these are quite real world situations as well that we've included, so they are quite relatable for the students.
Yeah, it's the kind of situations you can imagine you're finding yourself in every day, exactly. which makes it real to them.
Yeah, I also really like the useful language box here, because I think it's quite a useful tool to give students some language that they can kind of use to be involved in these sorts of conversations and interactions and so on. So it's definitely something that we can support them with.
Definitely.
Let me click back to the slideshow.
And so, as well as within the students' book having those lessons, we decided that we would also create a series of worksheets that are indexed here. So this index you see on this page shows the communicative worksheets that are focused on mediation skills, that are for which we have one for every unit, and they're linked to those D lessons, and they provide a more extended scenario for you to use to really develop those skills further in class. And often that happens through scenarios and role plays again. And we can look at an example of that on the next slide. So here we've got an example. This is the corresponding mediation worksheet for the lesson D that we just looked at, managing group conversations. And you can kind of see how this would lead to a really nice, lively class. So the students are presented with this scenario where the student is a group leader, and they have to lead the discussion of a problem and try to decide on a solution together with the other members of their group. And so the scenario is that they've gone out for a boat ride. They rowed to a large island in the middle of a lake. They left the boat there. They went off for a short walk on the island, but then they forgot to tie the boat up. So obviously the boat has floated off into the middle of the lake. They've lost the boat. It's 3 kilometers away. The sun's going down. It's almost dark. They've got hardly any food or water. One of them can't swim. Nobody knows where they are. They've got no reception on their mobile phone. So they can't make any phone calls, can't use the internet. And they have to think, what are they going to do next? And then on top of that, they have this time pressure that they only have 15 minutes to come up with a plan. And within that plan, they need to figure out, they can ask Scotty to teleport, except it's not a science fiction scenario. So they have to actually think, what would they realistically do in this situation? How they're going to find food and water, where they're going to sleep, how they're going to get out of there. So what types of things do you think that the students would have to do in this situation? in terms of employing mediation skills? Any ideas about what would be their process?
It's a fun one, I think, because it's quite an immersive task. So even if students might not even be aware that they're employing certain skills and certain mediation. I think it would be interesting that, so somebody's written here that first someone would be a group leader, and there would be an aspect of kind of organizing the group, which I think is true.
So kind of assigning roles, definitely.
Yes. Yeah.
So assigning roles
included.
Thinking about, so in terms of assigning roles, maybe thinking about what the skill sets of the people in the group are, who is the best person for each different job. Obviously, the person who can't swim, it wouldn't, they need to think about how to bring them along with them. They can't just all swim off to the boat and leave the person who can't swim. So they need to think of a way that includes everybody. Look at, as you say, Maria, look at people's skill sets. I know that there's a definite kind of aspect of bringing everybody on board together. People will have different opinions, so the group leader will need to manage the possible conflicts that arise from different people having different views about what should happen. And they've got this time, this really short amount of time to come up with a plan, so the time management aspect is also there. So they'll need to prioritize, they'll need to decide how diplomatic to be and how direct to be. So they'll have to decide on the right communication style for that particular situation. They might need to be more direct than if they had 1 hour to decide, where they could be more consultative. So there's all sorts of layers of things going on here. It's quite a sophisticated scenario, even on the surface of it, from the student's perspective. It's really fun, because it's this race against time, and they're going to come up with a plan, and it's a disaster. And that they are engaging with this without possibly realizing how sophisticated what they're trying to do is, but it's really developing all of those different skills.
Absolutely. If we have a look at another example, this is taken from New Close-Up, which is a secondary aged course. And in this course, we have this feature called the Live Well, Study Well lessons. And these are really focused on developing sort of healthy personal and study habits in students, and get them thinking about ways that they can improve the quality of their communication with others, with their peers, with people that they know at home, people they're unaware of, and look at ways of improving their kind of communication skills when it comes to tackling challenges and so on. So this actually a perfect case to kind of springboard into mediation skills. There's lots of things you can do here with pair work, with group work, and so on. This particular example, which is outlined in yellow, shows us a pair work task. And the situation here is that students are looking to the future, thinking about their future, their career futures, what they plan to do. And it's recognizing that maybe students might have a little bit of anxiety around this, maybe be nervous, not sure, uncertainty, and so on. So they're encouraged to take two different roles, the one of the student who's looking to the future and unsure about what to do, and the other as the kind of career advisor giving guidance. And they're encouraged, that person is encouraged to give advice, to act as kind of like a coach to the other learner, to help mentor them into the thought processes of thinking about what they'd like to do in the future, giving them this advice. And they can swap roles as well, so they get the chance to kind of experience it from both sides. And I think this is a really great way of helping to build empathy, to build understanding, thinking about another person's perspective, thinking about what might be right for them. So there's an aspect of critical thinking in there as well. And we've also got the accompanying teacher's notes here. And I think this second point here in particular is of relevance, that students need to make sure everyone is included in the discussion and is able to contribute ideas, for example, by allocating turns or roles or asking questions to encourage the quieter members to participate. And that is a really good example of how a student can act as a mediator in these sorts of pair work, group work activities.
Really managing that communication and ensuring that it's successful, and that really requires a whole new level of maturity for students at this kind of secondary stage of education. It's really helping them develop as communicators and as people.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think role play is a really powerful tool to do that, because it doesn't necessarily come naturally to all students, so putting them in that situation is going to be helpful. Another example is from our course, the new edition of Outcomes, which is another general English course for adults. And we have these special kind of mediation tasks that we've incorporated into the main body of the content. So these pull out a particular mediation skill and practice it in the context of the lesson. This particular example is a debate, which is a very popular task type in English teaching. And it's an excellent platform to develop mediation skills as well. There's lots of things that we can do with debates, so or that we can see kind of building the skills that are building when you have a debate. So in this case, you're putting students into two different groups. You're giving them a motion. Some of them are for the motion, some of them are against the motion, but they don't necessarily have the choice into which group they're put in, so that the group they're put in might not necessarily reflect their own feelings or thoughts or opinions. So there's that element of being forced to view something from a different perspective, and that can help to build empathy and to build understanding from a wider range of perspectives. Then there's the whole kind of skill of being able to develop and present an argument in a convincing manner and in a non-confrontational and understandable, clear, articulated way. So there's a lot that's going on here.
And I think with this task, Delia, like with a kind of past debate and some of the other extended speaking task examples that we've provided, they really provide excellent opportunities for formative assessment too. So, you know, for teachers to really be able to observe students put in their language skills in practice, but also some of those soft skills, like empathizing with others, like facilitating discussion, for you to really be able to observe that.
And this is supported through the kind of the teacher's book. So these here we've got taken extracts from the teacher's book notes, which help guide the teacher in seeing what the skill is that we're practicing here, what tasks it's linked to, and how to really kind of support your learners in getting there, and how you can kind of observe that as well. So as Rachel says in that sort of formative assessment piece there. And then just another example from Outcomes here as well. Again, we've got another mediation task here, which follows the conversation practice. And we wanted to show this example as well because it shows a different aspect of mediation. And in this context, it's more the kind of intercultural communication. So what's happening here is students are being asked to create a menu of dishes that are representative of the food from their country. And then with different partners, the partner asks for some advice. They're visiting that country. What would they recommend eating in that country? It's very, you can see that being a very relevant task, something that would definitely happen if they did travel to another country. You know, you'd want to ask those sorts of questions, have those sorts of interactions. So here there is that quite relevant aspect of being able to kind of explain something that is relevant and personal to you in a way that is meaningful to the other person. So if you're trying to explain something on a menu, a dish or something that maybe the other person doesn't know, how are you going to explain that in a way that is meaningful to them and also makes them want to eat it? Yeah,
it also touches on the plurilingual aspect here, doesn't it? Because you're kind of helping mediate understanding between languages. and facilitate understanding across languages too, which is we know in some places the aspect of mediation that has been the most focused on, particularly when we talk to teachers in Spain, in some of the escuelas oficiales there, that this aspect of mediation has been very much focused on over maybe other aspects like mediating a text or the intrapersonal mediation.
Absolutely, yeah. So this kind of leads us to think about how a lot of these tasks have sort of exemplified the way that you might use the skills that you're developing in the real world, and kind of placing you in situations which are kind of examples of the real world situations that you might find yourself in. So we thought we'd just use this moment to kind of pause and think about, well, what are those real world situations? How are mediation skills going to be relevant or useful in real world situations, real world communication? And I've put up a few symbols here that might represent some of our ideas. So if you want to just place in the chat anything you can think of in answer to this question, how are mediation skills useful in a real world context?
Yeah, what will a student be able to do better as a result of having mediation skills?
Exactly,
maybe is a good way of thinking about it. So
yes.
Share your ideas with us, please, based on what you've heard and what you already know.
And Marie has already said that this is so real, something which happens all the time. So that I think that's.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to make it feel relevant to the students, for the students to understand its usefulness to them. You know, something we hear a lot when we speak to teachers is the students don't always make the connection between what they learn in the classroom and the real world. And that's what we've been trying really hard to do through some of the activities we've developed, that, you know, create scenarios that they can actually imagine themselves in, and that they know that they might, you know, then they can see the usefulness of it. So Olivia is saying being impartial and to gain trust. Yeah, mediation skills really important to that. To be there in case of bullying. Maybe that aspect of empathy and facilitation. Communication is not misunderstood. Yeah, because it's really getting learners to think about their audience, not just think about the message. And I think when people are less confident in their language skills, they can be very self-aware, like very focused on themselves and how they're communicating, whether it's correct, whether it's accurate. But there's a danger then that you forget the person that you're speaking to and how they might be receiving that information, and how you're tailoring it to them. So it's reminding them of that. They might become
more open-minded as well. Yeah, that's a good comment, that can help to kind of broaden your mind and have more empathy with others, more understanding.
Learning to respond and not react. Yeah, exactly. Responding to actually what the other person is requiring.
I imagine it's a very good skill for a teenager, for sure. There may be the need for a mediator, especially during those initial early days when you're working internationally. Absolutely. There's a lot of kind of opportunity for misunderstandings and mishaps to happen. So yeah, absolutely, kind of finding.
I think training them in those intercultural skills in advance really helps them with that, though, I think.
Definitely, exactly.
Retelling
what happened. Yeah, in a way that is interesting and meaningful to people as well. So yeah, definitely being able to kind of retell a story, that is a form of mediation. Learning cultural differences, definitely. Yeah,
and I think we can imagine lots of like workplace scenarios where mediation is really relevant. You know, like even just preparing this presentation today, you know, Delia and I had to make decisions around what was the best way to visually represent the information. Some people who might be listening might be much more theory, analytical focused people who would prefer to see the models and the diagrams and the scientific element of this. Other people might respond better to practical examples. And we try to look at a variety of ways of sharing the information that might work for different people. So, and you as teachers do that every day. You know, you try to find the best way to get the message across to your students and to get the best response from them. So teachers are already often excellent mediators.
It's true. Yes. Yeah. We were talking in our session earlier that about the importance of creating a safe space for it to happen. And that is something that a teacher really it has a great opportunity to do for their students by creating a safe space within the classroom for students to feel comfortable and confident to practice these skills. Perhaps also considering some learners who might have specific learning differences, who maybe are a little bit less confident, or not as kind of skilled in interpersonal communication or kind of dealing with others and so on. So those sorts of safe spaces like the classroom and those sorts of activities like role play are hugely helpful in those cases.
And role plays are great because you're kind of giving somebody, you're feeding them a role, so they don't have to reveal too much about themselves. It's not too personal. They can inhabit that role that you've given them and play that out. And even role playing puts you in someone else's position, so it's already getting you to empathize with another possible version of you.
Definitely. Right, so that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we'd really like to open up the floor now to any questions. I think there might be some questions in the Q&A and the general discussion.
We have a number of questions. Thank you, ladies. That was delightful, very informative. One question that stood out for me is how to build relationships between culture and mediation, really exploring a little bit more that relationship between culture and mediation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the obvious link to intercultural skills and navigating between different language and cultural barriers at a kind of national level, but there's culture in a kind of broader understanding of the word culture, isn't there? There's also cultures that exist within workplaces, cultures that exist within families, cultures that might exist, within certain age groups, and when if you work in one school and you're used to the dynamic in a certain staff room, and you move to another school, you might encounter a new and slightly different culture. I'm sure lots of teachers who've moved from one school to another have experienced that themselves, and you have to learn that there's a whole new set of rules within which communication takes place, and that is very much linked to mediation. Learning that there are sort of social mores or socially acceptable ways of communicating or styles of communicating is very relevant to mediation.
Excellent. Thank you. Delia, anything to add, or shall I move on to the next one?
I mean, just to say that I agree with Rachel, and I think it's sort of a reflective thing as well, like thinking about you in those situations, like how am I bringing my culture as well, and how am I kind of explaining that and communicating that, and make in a way that doesn't make people feel uncomfortable, or make sure that your wants and needs are clear as well, and how you can kind of fit in with the others in that sense. I think there's a kind of like a two-way thing there as well.
I think that's a nice point, to be able to really emphasize that give and take, or not only are you being receptive and listening to other people's culture, you're sharing your own as well, and you have the skills and the ability to do that, which makes that connection so much more powerful. Thank you. Okay, what types of classroom activities are most likely or more likely to enhance mediation strategies? So we're looking for some tips and tricks, places to focus on in the materials.
Well, I think we've shown some examples today. I think some pretty good examples tend to include things like role play. We've talked a lot about role play, debate being another good one. But generally speaking, those sorts of like task-based activities where there might be a speaking aspect, there possibly is also, like in the examples from Voices, you're reading something, watching something as well, and you're kind of interpreting. There's so many different parts that you could actually bring it into.
And even to put a finer point on that, you guys brought up a great hypothetical situation. That's sort of what would you do situation. And that really allows you to, in a safe space, think a little bit more critically and allow learners to get in touch with what they would do in a situation like that. Like the boat.
I think role plays and hypothetical situations are great. And a lot of the, actually just reflecting myself, a lot of the examples that we showed you today related more to speaking scenarios. But, in terms of text, often things like, it could be fiction even, look at putting yourself in the position of a character and relating to that, navigating meaning within a text. Often I think if it's a slightly more extended task that you have a little bit more time to develop, as Delia said, a task-based or project-based approach really lends itself, because you do need a little bit more time to explore the different layers of what's happening and to go through a sequence where you're getting the students to reflect on what happened and how it could be more effective the next time round. I think having those stages in the learning sequence really help embed the ideas in the student's mind and make them really think about what's going on and not just see it at face value.
Excellent.
Another kind of everyday example I always think of is the lecture hall, where you're listening to your lecturer and you're taking down notes, you're writing notes based on what you're hearing or seeing from the slides, and that is also a form of mediation. So even those sorts of context, there's quite familiar context to many of our students. Again, listening to something, interpreting it, putting it down into their own words, that kind of thing is also a mediation task.
Because although it's not necessarily between two or more people, that kind of intrapersonal that's going on in your own mind is still mediation, because you are interpreting meaning yourself and you are, creating your own version of it that you will be able to engage with afterwards. So that process is still happening.
Good point. Now we're going to move to the next question. Manal reminds us that we can't forget about grammar. So Manal's wondering, how are grammatical mistakes addressed in mediation activities? That old question of, do you stop somebody who's on a roll, who's really getting into the activity and sharing to correct those grammatical possibly mistakes? What's your recommendation in these types of activities?
That everybody's got a different opinion on this. I mean, and everybody's got their own teaching style, I think. So I think, it's still a language classroom. It's still a language classroom, and you want to be able to support learning, and accuracy does still have its importance. But I think you've just got to make a decision as a teacher what to prioritize in a particular teaching moment. So if the main focus of your lesson at that point in the lesson is mediation, you might decide to be a little bit more lenient in some aspects of correcting them if you think it's going to disrupt the flow of the lesson. But, and you might also be, your own students. You might know that with certain students, it's like water off a duck's back. You can correct them, they'll take it in, but it won't disrupt them. With other students, it might feel more disruptive. It might be better to wait till afterwards or for another moment. I think you have to use your instincts. Delia, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it, as you say, it's sort of what the purpose of the task is, whether you're kind of practicing more fluency of language, or if you're looking specifically for kind of accuracy and so on. But the other thing you could potentially do as well is one of those kind of classic feedback tasks, which is where you take any errors that you've heard during the task and put them out to the students, either by putting them on the board or however, and actually getting students to negotiate with each other why it's incorrect and what the correct form should be and what's the meaning and what's happened there, how did it occur, and so on. So that, again, that's sort of another mediation task to look at those errors as well.
Mediation within mediation. You heard it here first. Okay. And just to sort of round this out, somebody mentioned in the chat, I've always told teachers to give priority to fluency in any task wherein mediation is the focus. Am I on the right path?
Well, it depends. Yeah, I mean, if mediation is your focus, I guess, yeah, you know, that you want to be looking at the skills that are required for mediation. And if the understanding of comprehension is breaking down, then that might be a point at which to stop and to start, you know, getting involved in correcting, because that mediation will not happen. And you've got to bring students back together to say, well, how can we overcome these kind of barriers and this breakdown in communication?
Delia, I think that's a great point. If the comprehension is breaking down, it's time to step in. That's a nice kind of concrete takeaway to think about, certainly in situations. Ladies, we have time for one more question. Can you touch more on plurilingualism?
Oh, that was from Maria. I saw that earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. On plurilingualism in relation to mediation, I think that in including plurilingualism as part of the update to the CEFR, the Council of Europe really wanted to recognize that recognize the importance of other languages. This isn't, you know, learning a language is about facilitating communication and about inclusivity. It's not about prioritizing one language over another. It's about prioritizing communication itself. And hence, you know, the focus on mediation and the drive to really just focus on the quality of communication between people. And to some extent, mediation facilitates plurilingualism, because often, in the case like we saw in outcomes, often the mediator, the person who is acting in the role of the mediator, is acting as an intermediary between languages and between people who might not speak each other's language. So yeah, you know, our students are in a language classroom where they may be learning English, but they are going to go out of that classroom and facilitate communication between people who might not speak each other's languages as an intermediary, and encourage communication to happen between people where it might not have been possible otherwise. So I think that's where the focus on plurilingualism comes in. Delia, I don't know if you thoughts to add to that.
I think there is, like, when it comes to mediation practice in the classroom, there is a little bit of, you do have to accept, even if you're not necessarily as pro to bringing in a first language, but you know, that such a big part of it is that, as you say, that kind of like, translation in a way, but also just kind of intercultural understanding. And even when you think about the intrapersonal communication, when students are kind of working things out in their heads, they will naturally be translating between languages. So it kind of falls part of that as well. So when they're mediating concepts in an intrapersonal way, that is within a pluricultural space as well.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point and a nice place to end. Rachel, Delia, thank you so much for that fantastic session. And
well,
really,
thank you everyone who joined and
active
participation. It's always so much more enjoyable for all of us when you participate so actively.
Absolutely. Now, before you leave, I do have a couple things to mention. Right after the session, you will be directed to a feedback survey, so please let us know what you thought. Many of the examples that Rachel and Delia showed today were from our National Geographic learning programs, including Voices and Outcomes 3rd edition for young adult and adult learners, as well as New Close-Up for teens. Now, if you are interested in learning more about any of our National Geographic learning programs in your classroom, please visit our website, eltngl.com. or contact your local National Geographic Learning representative, and I'll put that website in the chat. So you saw examples of Voices, Outcomes, and New Close-Up in our all-in-one interactive online learning platform called Spark. To request a demo of any of these programs on Spark, again, please visit the series page of the program you are interested. You can navigate there from eltngl.com. Please be sure to join our online community for teachers of English on our social media channels, where we will offer up-to-date information about events, practical classroom tips, and exciting real-world content, as well as new product information. So again, here is our website in the chat. Thank you all so much for attending, and we hope you all have a wonderful day, evening, or afternoon. Thanks again, Rachel and Delia. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
All
Caitlin
right.
and Caroline.